this Thomas Sheehan Stanford lectures. Let us go around and introduce ourselves. I know that people, when we do theological stuff, they care where we're coming from. So if somebody is an actual Catholic bishop or something, like, that would be good to know. If we had the Pope on here, that would be good to spell out where you're coming from. So people on the podcast probably know I had a substantial religious upbringing. Not that my parents were particularly strict about it, but like, I went to Jesus camp and I got confirmed and had to go through all that business in a United Church of Christ, which is a pretty liberal church, and then became more or less the village atheist sort of thing, or just didn't find it, as I got into philosophy, didn't find it that interesting. And so it's been a rediscovery as far as the podcast goes, that some of this stuff is actually worth reading, worth caring about, and I've been surprised with the historical stuff in particular, of how many people are just really fascinated by this stuff. People that don't necessarily, I think in fact it's more people that are sort of on the edge, that are not committed to religion anymore, but it's sort of played enough of a part of their upbringing that they find this as a historical topic particularly interesting. Tara, you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not used to doing these. It's actually Tara Lee. And what are we saying? We're just saying our name and, like, if we're religious, kind of?
Or, yeah, whatever you feel the need.
Okay. I am actually still religious. I was raised evangelical, and I am now Episcopalian, which is kind of along the lines of Anglican. I am probably I'm probably as far out theologically as one can be and still call oneself a Christian. Yes, and I think that the historical stuff is very interesting, and I was talking about the lectures with a friend of mine who's an atheist, who's a staunch atheist, and it did bring up interesting issues, because I did feel like Sheehan, he's also a very liberal Christian, obviously, but I felt like he was a little self-congratulatory in terms of, like, thinking of himself as, like, very liberal and open-minded, and I was listening to it and thinking, like, yeah, but you and I, we both want to cling to some things. So it was interesting. I liked it. Were
you familiar already with N.T. Wright before coming in here? That's the name that's constantly pulled out by actually religious people approaching this.
No, I'm not. Okay. I actually haven't heard that name. No.
Okay.
Nope.
Michael?
Yep. Hello, I'm Michael. What more? So, I guess the first time I said I wasn't a Christian was to my grandmother when I was 12, and then for about 5 years I developed into something more like a pre-anti-theist position, and then by about 2021 I sort of got over all that. I mean, that's somewhat condescending. I went to an atheist meetup group in London a few weeks ago, and it was just a den of hypocrisy and conspiracy theories and poor critical thought. They just go on and on about how critical thinking was so important, and then every third sentence would be this ridiculous claim that had no substantiation whatsoever. So I guess I've converted from a anti-theist into a person who's on the fence about the best way of characterizing religion. Let's put it that way. So I see some positive aspects and I see some negative aspects, and mostly I'm at this point in time interested in focusing on the positive aspects, and happy to consign those negative ones mostly to the class of things that are just problems to deal with in most spheres of human activity, rather than particularly religious ones. So my interest, I've always been academically interested in the Bible and in Christian literature and in religious literature. I used to characterize that as being interested in fantasy, in the way that I'm interested in fantasy novels and things. I think there's some truth to that it is quite interesting just what kind of things people end up believing. In any case, I'm probably ranting now, so that's me.
And I know you're calling from London. Tara Lee, where are you calling in from?
Oh, I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Okay. And then John?
Hey, I'm John Lutters, coming to you from my messy studio apartment in Washington, D.C. I was raised Catholic and went to Catholic school, and since been very, very lapsed, although I was never actually religious. I'm not confirmed or anything. But I had an experience growing up where almost nearly 100% of the really, truly excellent and happy people who I've encountered in my life have been deeply religious. And that's just, I think, largely a consequence of having gone to Catholic school for my whole life and just having a lot of very good influences and being completely unable to believe any of the theology around it for whatever reason. So I just think it's a fascinating subject, and I see a lot of positives in religion, and I always have, despite not being able to buy almost any part of it. So I think looking at the history of it is important, but none of it is certain, so it can sort of whitewash the good and the bad. But I think it's fascinating trying to sort out something that's impossible to know objectively.
All right, Chris.
I grew up a Methodist lay preacher's kid with compulsory Sunday school, which meant I was an evangelical atheist by the time I was 9. At 15, I managed somehow or other to get a peak spiritual experience out of the blue. Started looking for a language of expression for that, and finally, after about 25 years, arrived back where I'm currently introduced as that very liberal guy in an evangelical Anglican church.
All right, so maybe to start off, before we kind of get into the content, who here, I know some people on the board had some beefs about Sheehan, so this is my introduction to the topic, really, and he presents himself as that there is some kind of consensus among historians, and the historians, in fact, most of the stuff that he's putting forward in terms of the Q source document was even established by the 1930s. So this is something that goes way back, and that these historians are not, some fringe atheist group, as people often attack the Jesus, or evangelicals, he says, often attack the Jesus seminar today, but that represents a long-standing historical tradition of scholarship, for the most part, was restricted to Jesus scholars talking to each other, from within a religious organization with academic credentials, but only recently has been something that's been self-consciously flung out to the larger populace to enter the culture wars, so to speak, but that we should, there's a good amount of appeal to authority, really, in the approach here, that Sheehan is saying, well, all scholars across the board will agree to this, and when I throw this out, as I've been, so that's why I mentioned N.T. Wright already, that's a name that people have countered when I am bringing this up, like, oh, well, no, that there is an official church position that will accept something of the historical critical method, but will still say there's no agreement that, well, the resurrection is obviously something that was made up after the fact, or all the other sort of really important, Sheehan says really the whole chronology of Jesus' life is an invention of Mark, that it's, all we know is that there were probably these, or most likely that there were these sayings documents that were filtering around, and that we have some sort of independent verification of the date of his execution and the time that he was baptized by John the Baptist, and that's really all we know. Everything else is sort of the evolution of these faith communities writing apologetics, writing something to record their traditions and cope with this tragedy of their political leader, somebody who was trying to get the Romans off their backs and move Jewish society into something that would look fundamentally different, that would have more egalitarianism and more compassion in it. And so that all these the stories that we get are more and more far-fetched elaborations of something that is basically a rationalization. So what did you think about this claim to scholarly objectivity? Who wants to start?
This was just a glaring issue I saw. Like, to some extent, I was listening to it when he was talking like that, and I was thinking, I am not a scholar, and so whenever, I listen to like lectures on physics, and I listen to lectures on all sorts of things, and I have to be like, oh, well, I guess that's what they're saying they think. I mean, I don't know, like, what the fuck? But it's there was one thing that he mentioned that he referred to consistently as though it was accepted generally by mainstream historians of Christianity, which I know for a fact is highly questioned, and that was the attestations, or whatever the word is, of Josephus. Josephus was a historian who said we have things that he supposedly wrote about Christ. There's, I know, 2 references to Christ, or Yeshua, and one of the, I've read both of them, and I haven't done a lot of reading in this field, but I know enough from like Old English literature that a lot of times you can actually tell pretty easily when something has been written in at a later date. And one of the pieces of Josephus, a lot of historians believe it was inserted at a later date, and it reads like something that was inserted at a later date by Christians. It, like, Josephus talks in this very like historical, almost objective voice a lot of the time, and then all of a sudden he says like, and then there was this wonderful man named Jesus of Nazareth, and he was a wonderful person, and he did wonderful things, and he was cruelly crucified, and it doesn't read like historical fact. So the fact that Sheehan quotes it as though it's accepted by the historical community was sort of a red flag to me. I was like, so then how much of what you're saying may not be accepted by the historical community? Since I'm not a historian, I don't have enough expertise. It's like those physicists. I don't know. I don't know how much they're telling the truth and how much they're not about their field. So that was the one observation I had about that.
There's been a lot of toing and froing about the Testimonium Flavianum over the years. At one point it was pretty much unanimous that it was all inserted by a Christian scribe, but opinion seems to have been coming back recently to the idea that there was something in there which was decorated by a Christian scribe, and that's slightly supported by the, I think it was about a year and a half ago, they came across a Syriac manuscript which wasn't in the same chain of translation as the version that we know, which actually had about half of it, which didn't say was particularly marvellous, but did actually mention that he existed.
Okay, interesting.
For what it's worth.
Yeah. Hey, we just had a new person join. Benjamin, say where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Passau, Germany.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad we did this so early in the day, so we can get so many Europeans that are still awake.
Yeah,
so we're just discussing the degree to which Sheehan represents the scientific consensus, or how we could even know that. Any other folks have thoughts on that?
There's a brief summary on the Wikipedia page for the historicity of Jesus. Citations for what I'm about to read are listed as William R. Herzog, Prophet and Teacher, Introduction to Historical Jesus from 2005, and Authenticating the Archives, Activities of Jesus by Bruce Clinton in 2002. But it says that according to these 2 books anyway, that the things that are generally agreed upon as historical facts about Jesus of Nazareth were that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, he called disciples, he had a controversy at the temple, he was crucified by the Romans between 26 and 36 AD. He was a Galilean. His activities were confined to Galilee and Judah. After his death, his disciples continued, and many, or some rather, of his disciples were persecuted. And looking around for various sources about what is and is not disputed, those seem consistent with what people, who are willing to say that Jesus was objectively a real person, are willing to grant about it. And that's just a list that is there, but looking into it, that seems to be what is generally said that most people agree upon. It seems to be the most objective account of events.
I just wanted to say, so there's 2 things to say as well. He was lecturing in 2006, so that's 10 years ago almost. And I know that even in 2009, that he himself had said the consensus had shifted slightly on some of the things he was saying. And so today, it may well be that some of the things he's talking about, for example, the debate about the apocalyptic nature of Jesus' teachings, I think has shifted slightly more to the apocalyptic side than it was when he was speaking, for example. So there's a lot of things to say, and there's lots of things he's just gliding over as well when he speaks. He's not really necessarily misrepresenting things. I looked some of these things up, and he'll say blah blah, and the consensus is that, for example, on Josephus, and then you look at what the claim he's linking to that claim is. Doesn't require we take what he's saying quite so forcefully as he's presenting it. I mean, what he's really trying to do is take a way of reading the text with a set of background assumptions in, and put in lots of pieces of evidence into that machinery to build up a probability, if you like, of something being true. Now, one of those background assumptions has to be, for me, for example, is that the Christian text can't be treated as sacred. That they can't be exceptionalized. That is to say, if you compare them to other texts of that time, before and after, all of which describe the life of a deity or a semi-deity or something of that kind, and if you're going to introduce a degree of skepticism towards the activities of deities and magic and the rest of it about those texts, then you have to introduce them with respect to the Christian text as well. And that, for me, therefore, almost automatically rules out the resurrection, almost automatically rules out the timeline of Jesus' life, basically, and makes it almost necessarily an invention of Mark. Now, I think when he says there's a consensus about some of these things, he's really talking about a consensus in a secular community, which almost has to necessarily agree that those things have to be fictionalized products of the author of the documents, because otherwise you're treating them as sacred. You're saying, well, no, we have to have a degree of, we're banning our skepticism about these magical acts, but not others. So I think the community he's talking about is actually a far narrower one than we're talking about here. We're talking about the entire community of people commenting on the Bible that have scholarly inclinations. I think what is a smaller community, a secular community, a community of people who are, who are basically treat this as a purely historical authored document and not something with any sacred commitments or faith-based commitments one way or another. Yeah. And that's a much smaller community than we might be thinking of.
I'm not really sure that we could call it an exclusively secular community that he's speaking to, because obviously a lot of the authors he's referring to have faith commitments of one kind or another. I think the distinction we would draw would be there'd be a certain willingness to approach these documents in a secular mindset, in addition to, or sort of maybe separate from, we would have to say, their faith or religious implications. Because I don't have the statistics, but I would imagine that the vast majority of people he's talking to imagine themselves to have some sort of faith commitment. In the Partially Examined Life podcast, we had Law, who obviously he takes a very sort of secular, scientific, historical approach, but he still considers himself a Christian in a certain understanding of that word.
When he divides up his commitment seemingly between, speaking as a preacher here,
right, exactly,
the Christ of faith, and then speaking as a rational person who is a philosophy instructor, and he can separate those out.
Right, but he wouldn't exclude himself from a religious community or a religious understanding, and quite the opposite. So I would say that the audience for Sheehan is quite broad, but it is restricted by a certain way of thinking about things. You're absolutely right.
So I wasn't talking about the audience. I mean, you came in a little late. So the discussion was he's speaking about a community of scholars, and he's often trying to represent a consensus amongst that community. And I was saying that, yes, if you broaden the notion of community large enough to include all relatively scholarly commentators on the Bible, you will find that he probably consistently misrepresents the consensus. What I'm saying is, if you narrow that community down to a community of very ardent skeptics about most of the sort of major background assumptions that broad commentators would have, to a community that he's part of, that Bart Ehrman's part of, that other people like that him are part of, you would find that actually amongst that very sort of radically secular community, you would find that actually probably represents the consensus much more reliably.
Okay,
and
I see what you're saying.
What I picked up from that's not a bad thing. I quite like that he represents that consensus.
Sure.
I don't care about the consensus of religious.
He does say in terms of the community that it's the people that get grants in this area. Like that's That's sort of how you can tell who's esteemed.
Yeah, he's pretty explicitly in the scholarly community, and as Mark just said, he makes a lot of mentions to people who are professional academics in terms of who he's discussing for a consensus.
Which is very familiar, if you read like the Brian Leiter's, the biggest philosophy blog in the world, that is all. Who should we take seriously is a matter of how high they are in the scholarly hierarchy. That it's not if you have somebody that comes along, could write a Sam Harris, one of the most widely read philosophy books, but no, he doesn't even have a PhD. He doesn't have a tenure track, so not worth even paying attention to.
Well, he's right on that instance, isn't he?
It's a fine, if you're just approaching the subject like Tara Lee said, where you just don't know anything about it. Like, it's a fine first brush. Like, well, okay, what are the people that actually paid for this? But then there's the question that goes throughout this of, okay, there's an establishment and there's a consensus within that. But what if you're critiquing the establishment itself? So this very much comes up in an interdisciplinary way. And so we as philosophers are not in this establishment of historical Jesus scholars, which might have a different center, and then somebody, one of the only people that criticized the Jesus Parables episode was somebody said, you picked Crossan, who's this maverick who funds his activities through, preaching at Unitarian churches. Why couldn't you pick somebody, from the organization that's put itself in charge of preserving and understanding these books for thousands of years? In other words, somebody like N.T. Wright, who is an actual bishop.
Well, speaking as a lapsed Unitarian, I take umbrage with that.
Wait. How do you be a lapsed Unitarian? How do you stop believing nothing? Can you elaborate on that?
You stop drinking coffee, basically.
Oh, that's great.
I mean, I myself am fairly elitist, so I'm quite happy for the. See, I think if you start if you take this sort of Foucauldian approach to society, where you say, well, because it's human beings doing something, therefore everything is just human beings doing something, therefore there's no truth to anything, therefore everything's just in terms of communities of people with consensuses and centers and blah 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 blah. If you were an alien and that's all you heard and you came to Earth, you'd be amazed how we managed to do anything. Oh, there's all these machines, there's all these people doing things, there's all this light coming in and computers working. How on earth with these consensuses did you get all this stuff? I think that's because actually consensuses do revolve around the truth and sometimes do get to it. And I'm more and more inclined towards an elitist view of knowledge, where the more time you spend on it and the more effort to put into it and the more you have the right method, the better your results are. And so I don't want people who've been spending thousands of years getting it wrong. I want people who've been spending decades getting it right.
Yeah,
whether it's science or religion or anything else.
In Sheehan's defense, he does say several times during the lectures that this is all subject to things we might discover, like maybe we'll dig up another Gospel of Thomas in the deserts of Egypt again. He mentioned several times that any consensus can change rapidly with the discovery of new texts. So he's not just being obnoxious, like this is exactly what all of us high-minded individuals think, so that's right. He seems to be pretty open to new interpretations based on new evidence.
Well,
yeah,
he's pushing forward, that he's trying to teach in this class. The reason he's going on at such length about some things is he's trying to teach us the method so that we can decide for ourselves. But even having sat through this, granted, I didn't read any of the books that he was. This is an actual course with. Hopefully, you're going home and doing homework. Although the amount of repetition in the lectures makes it feel like I'm not missing anything. Like that. It's more designed to listen to and have like at least the important ideas just are pounded in your head again and again, so you don't really have to spend that much time on it.
Well, I watched the 26 hours of lectures by what's his name, Dale something at Yale on the New Testament, and he adopted a kind of an attitude that I sometimes adopt in speaking, which is somewhat combative, and saying he'll go oftentimes and say, "Well, I'm going to lie to you. I'm going to lie to you. You need to." And he'll misrepresent what some of the text says, and then 5 minutes later goes, but did it really say that? And go back and show what it actually said. I think that's just to engage with the people in the audience who are going to think he's lying whatever he says, and to get them to check what he says. And if you actually check, and if you adopt his method, you will find that he's right. So I think with these speakers, what they implicitly assume is, and I think they're correct in this assumption, that if you just get out from your mind all of these background assumptions and prejudices coming into it and just take an honest look at what's there, in the way that they're taking the look, in the sort of scientized procedure, you will come out with, roughly speaking, their conclusions. Whether it's exactly their conclusion, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
What you'll come out with is something much more honest with respect to the text than, what was invented in the 1950s by, anti-communist propaganda or something.
At this point, having listened to the lectures, I still feel like I'm appealing to authority. That I'm all right. Sheehan said, maybe I'll read a couple other things, and hopefully, what you have to say here will fill me in to give it make me a little more skeptical. But I don't feel like, even though it's been presented with here's the scientific method, so you can describe for yourself. Like, that sounds really philosophically respectable. Really, with any matters of fact, that it's not just a matter of how plausible does it sound to me. Does this argument sound good or not? We're always sort of taking somebody else's word for it and do the best we can.
This is something I wanted to sort of maybe guide the discussion towards and throw out to the group, is because this is a disappointment of mine. Sheehan really doesn't spend any time describing what he means when he says the scientific method, in terms of textual analysis, in terms of saying, well, this is probably goes back to Jesus, and this probably doesn't. This is very much from the perspective of someone who's only listened to the lectures. This is very much you're taking his word for it, because he doesn't go into any of the details at all. So I wanted to sort of throw this out to the group, maybe start with some of the people who haven't spoken since I've got on, and ask what exactly is your understanding of how these conclusions are drawn, and then maybe we can try and tease out some of the methodology and maybe some of the drawbacks or problems that this methodology could have.
One thing that I think he mentioned specifically is, when people define dates for things, he says that if this person makes a sort of fictional prediction that some event is going to happen, we can assume that that person lived near the time of the event that he is saying someone 100 years ago predicted, because he's trying to make up a,
That was really interesting.
Yeah, I thought
about the Book of Daniel. That was a really surprising cool part of the.
Yeah.
And also I think that there were three criteria he laid out. One was being, I think it was something along the lines of, embarrassing for the.
Right.
So if something is embarrassing for the establishment that this person belongs to, then it's likely that it's true, because if they found it, they would erase it because it's embarrassing. That's how history was written at the time. Also, if things were written, by two separate sources, I think, and I forgot the exact word he used for that. He does. So he does.
Attestation.
Yeah, and so he does go in a little bit into exactly what his method is, and I actually hadn't thought of the backdating of predictions. I enjoyed that a lot. So, teasing out whether or not those are the best ways to do it might be a good idea, because he does say that this is how we're doing it, and that, for all I know, might be how everyone has always done it. So I want to know what everyone's thoughts are, if those are good ways to go about it, or if you know about better ways, in terms of the methods that he lists for what he claims constitutes a likelihood or a high likelihood.
I actually, the one of those methods that he mentioned that I had sort of issues with was the criterion of embarrassment. There's a lot that's assumption laden, for sure. Yeah, it is, and I kept going back and forth on that, because I kept thinking, like, initially when he said that, I was like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, because it makes Christianity look bad to say Peter ran away from Jesus or whatever. But there was on talking it over with a friend of mine, I was kind of like, but he kept saying, but that's it's a plot device as well. I mean, it's also a problem in your plot that then the mythos gets to sort of solve by redeeming that person or forgiving that person or whatever, which I thought was an interesting point, and the criterion of embarrassment was one that I sort of marked in my mind as, like, I'm not sure I buy into that one. The other thing I sort of assumed is going on in the background with all of these scholars is just a lot of linguistic studies. I studied linguistics just enough to understand, like, they can track a lot of stuff linguistically, like they can track a lot of really interesting historical things linguistically. So I sort of assume that that is going on, but I was actually also a little disappointed that that didn't get talked about in more detail. I was actually kind of hoping that I kind of wanted more nitty gritty in terms of like how do these historians, like, I don't know, I wanted like archaeology. I was
right,
like
the two endings of Mark. The two endings of Mark was a big thing. He kept repeating that, like, yeah, Mark. The story of Mark ends with they just find and the tomb is empty and that's it, or Jesus is just dead.
Yeah.
And then somebody, that was too bleak, so somebody added on, and he presented this as something just, well, can you just read us a little of the Aramaic or something, the Greek, I mean, to say, characterize why scholars would think that this was obviously an add-on. That would have been nice to hear.
Well, there's the evidence, having read sort of, unfortunately, quite a lot outside of what we were assigned to read or listen to. For this particular case, I believe, if my memory serves, is that the oldest and best manuscripts we have of Mark don't have the ending at all. Yeah. And it's something that shows up later and is so it's pretty clear, and it's not really a linguistic argument. Rather, it's just that the original version didn't include this sort of,
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I recall that about the Gospel of Thomas. That I was a little unclear. It sounds like the Gospel of Thomas that was discovered, fairly recently was the full-blown Gnostic text. But then somehow they got this Thomas Sayings document out of it that they think is way old within that. So that was unclear to me whether that was actually two different document finds, or one of which was just the sayings, or whether that was a purely linguistic thing.
Oh, yeah.
So say that again. What you're unclear about what?
So the Gospel of Thomas was something that was sort of discovered within the last few decades, was added to the canon, and I recall Sheehan referring to the Gospel as a whole being very Gnostic, being on, like John sermonizing.
If he said that, he's wrong. I mean, the Gospel.
Okay, then maybe I'm just forgetting something. But I had also remembered him referring to Thomas material as being some of the oldest, sort of on parallel with Q, as being a sayings collection from a different.
That is
the north or the south. The Q was the north and Thomas was the south. I forget.
It's problematic. Q in general is problematic, and again, that's something that he glosses really heavily. He appeals to the consensus, and it is the consensus, we should say.
So Benjamin, we all, before you jumped on, gave sort of our backgrounds in this. It sounds like you've been studying this area for a while. What's your religious background, or where are you coming to this from?
I'm going to say enthusiastic amateur. I started off reading, I think like a lot of people, reading a book by Bart Ehrman, and wow, oh my God, look at all this interesting things that nobody seems to know, I never seem to hear about. And so I've read a lot of his books, and more recently gotten into the historicity question from a variety of angles, and trying to understand what exactly is the argument. And my biggest question is sort of a philosophical question, which is, if we could time travel back to the 1st century and we were in Palestine, we went looking for the quote-unquote historical Jesus, how would we know when we found him? What would count as fulfilling enough criteria that we knew we had the right guy? And trying to sort of tease that apart, and from the gospel accounts, from Paul especially, finding it a very vexed question, and obviously the more questions, the more interested we philosophers are in it. So that's my background, but nothing academic.
Now, I take that to be a very extreme burden to place upon biblical scholarship. I don't actually think it could ever really meet that level. I mean, what I take this whole process to be about is, what is it most reasonable to believe, given all the evidence we have at the current moment, about all the evidence we have at the current moment? What is the best model that fits it all? And in that light, things like the criteria of embarrassment, or the problem of embarrassment and things, they fall into potentially sway you when you have no other way of going one direction or another. You've got two models or n number of models, and they both have no pull or push one way or another, and one seems slightly more embarrassing. Okay, well, we're not saying it's the true one. We're saying what is it most reasonable to believe, and if you think that that criteria makes it slightly more reasonable to believe that one, then I think that's the one you should endorse. I don't think there's ever a point in time where we can really not argue about any of these principles, because they're not reliable guides to the truth. They're not instruments picking up electrical signals. They're just about establishing which one, given every other piece of evidence, is it slightly more reasonable to believe than everything else. And I'm not convinced that the picture of Jesus we get out of that process will be sufficiently full of detail in order to actually go back and pick out Jesus Christ from Jesus, let's say, from all people of the time. It might be that the picture we get out of it, which is, according to Sheehan, very, very minimal one, someone who may not even be apocalyptic, who may only have a few sayings to his name or parables, someone who's just basically an Aesop's fabulist of the turn of the millenniums, which it seems to be like probably everyone, or at least quite a lot of people at that time. So for me, my investment is being able to discount models of the evidence, not really counting some in. My point is to try and discount the less reasonable ones and count in the more reasonable ones.
This is a good shift, I guess, to what we think of the primary, what I saw as the factual crux, that is the claim of a picture of how the Gospels were created, that we really don't know much historically about this figure at all, and that it is entirely reasonable to assume that what we have are these few maybe facts of that there was a guy preaching this stuff, and a very early tradition of here are sayings attributed to this person, right? Whether it was even one person, maybe it wasn't one person, but it's just like we're in the same situation as with Confucius or Buddha or something, that at least there's this core of sayings that if you think it's worth acknowledging that there was such a person at all, or then at least you could grasp onto that. But then the crux of the historical story that he's presenting is that through then over the period of 50 years or so after the death of this person, that you get these traditions that record their rationalizations of the death of this person, that why that's it doesn't fit with the story that he would have been killed, so therefore it must have been something that's foretold, and this rising Christology. So what do folks think of this overall picture? This to me was the big takeaway from here, and I found it utterly reasonable and explained a lot that I had as a kid. Oh, well, Isaiah predicted that somebody like this would come along, and then I had heard more recently, well, there were a lot of claimed messiahs at the time entirely because of the Isaiah predictions being so big in the Jewish culture at the time, and now I read here that in fact, most of this stuff, what you would do as somebody in one of these traditions, given that there's no internet, there's no newspapers, there's no real good ways of getting information, is you would study your sacred scriptures and use that to elaborate, well, okay, then he's a martyr, so it must be like the other Jewish martyrs in the tradition, according to Daniel and other books, that they are going to come back. They will be raised right to the right hand of God, and that this sort of method becomes then enhanced sort of by tall tales to become more and more. Sheehan doesn't say it's more and more outrageous. He doesn't say, but he becomes more and more literary, and he really has a high literary praise for the Book of John, the sort of furthest removed from the historical death period.
Well, I mean, it rings, I don't know, for the non-Americans in the room, I guess, but it rings very similar to the old cherry tree type of things about American founding fathers, and attributing to them all of these weird events just to glorify them, like, Lincoln walking 10 miles to return 10 cents for someone who overpaid at a store or something like that, to take some characteristics of this individual that were well known and just elaborate on them in huge ways to create sort of a narrative about why they were so spectacular.
A mythic narrative, a mythic biography.
To create
this even happens now. With history, he was saying, typically a generation after some hero has died, then you get all these things surrounding them. You think of it, well, I was going to say Elvis, but other than his supposed continued existence after a fake death, there's nothing comparable there.
My uncle saw Ronald Reagan punch a bear in the face, so. Poor, these things happen, man.
The real problem for someone trying to establish a historical Jesus as well is that once you subtract everything from the Gospels that is clearly designed to fit into predictive narratives from the Hebrew Bible, you're left with actually very little. You're left with, a lot of the events, a lot of the decoration of the events, a lot of the the crown of thorns, the whole sort of symbolism. I mean, everything but the crucifixion itself, I guess. There's just so much in there that is trying to so obviously and self-consciously fit in predicted bits from the Old Testament, especially Isaiah and Daniel. Right. But if you think all of that is right for subtraction, you're actually left with very little. Mm-hmm. So the problem is then, are these all? If you wanted to go for a mythicist position, you'd have to say, well, if the historical grounding of this person's life exists in these gospel narratives, and if these gospel narratives are so clearly, in many places, designed to fit prophetic predictions, what in these gospel narratives is historical? Because the Richard Carrier, who's a famous non-establishment mythicist, and who's not crazy conspiratorial mythicist like Zeitgeist films and things. I mean, he takes the Gospels to be euhemerizations, which is to say, books written about divine beings that place them on the earth. Now, if you were to look at the earliest texts about Jesus, which are, for example, Paul, almost all of them treat Jesus as having been resurrected by that point and being in heaven and being divine. I mean, when Paul says he's spoken to Jesus, he means he's received revelation from heaven. So I don't want to get too sidetracked, but there is a big problem with just trying to untangle the Gospels from what is designed to meet literary and prophetic and agenda-based interests, and what is actually trying to be recorded as historical at all. Like what events are meant to be historical. And there's something that come out like the sword and the oil and bits and pieces because of the criterion of embarrassment. So actually some of the bits and pieces that are meant to be historical are even on the lowest rungs of what principles we should use when deciding these things. So it's a very complex affair.
I have to say, Michael, I'm very grateful that you were the first person to say the word euhemerization and not me, because I was afraid I'd have to broach this whole subject. So thanks for bringing that in. So I didn't have.
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not convinced that they are. I'm just saying that actually, if you compare a mythicist narrative of like a really respectable mythicist, very contemporary respectable mythicist narrative of the Gospels and of the New Testament as a whole, you will find that a lot of the claims are exactly the claims, very surprisingly, that leading historical scholars will make. Like, for example, when Paul talks about the rulers of the world, Dale at Yale said what Paul meant there was also demons and angels. He didn't just mean earthly powers like Rome. And the more and more you see Paul as talking about a divine being and non-earthly powers, the more strange and peculiar the idea of a historical series of events given Paul, how strange that seems. So, well, I'm not really making a point here, I'm just trying to complicate things, but it is very difficult to separate out what the authors are trying to do from what the from any historical motivations. I mean, people were talking about Josephus earlier, and even as a quote-unquote historian, he's just not very good. Like when he's describing the destruction of the Second Temple, he says something like the ghosts banged the doors and the angels came down and the cows were lifted up and gave birth to rabbits or something, and he puts all that in the text as part of the destruction of the Second Temple, which is a historical event. So it's very difficult to even know where to begin and end with historical claims in these texts.
Yeah. Chris, I'm anxious to hear you jump in on anything that we've been talking about, or something of your own perspective.
Right. Starting at the beginning. Back to the Jesus Seminar criteria. I'm not very fond of the criterion of dissimilarity as it's applied by them. One reason.
Can you remind me what that was? I don't remember.
Oh, yeah. if something's very similar to what people before him in that society were saying, it wasn't him. It's been interjected.
Okay.
And if it's very similar to what the church was saying a century later, it isn't him because the church has added it. The problem with that is that if you prove somebody else has written before, you've got nothing left. And I have definitely written those things. So you've got, for instance, the episode of him apparently talking about marriage. He comes down in favour of Shammai rather than Hillel, and you can see him coming down in favour of one of them, and the fact that he elsewhere comes out with things that are more or less paraphrases of Hillel, such as what are the greatest commandments, which Hillel did something like 40 years earlier on much the same basis. It's very likely that somebody is going to have been repeating things. If you prune out everything that he's absorbed from his society, you're going to get a very flat picture. That's one thing that strikes me. I don't like the Jesus Seminar terribly much because of their voting system and the fact that most of the conservative scholars self-selected themselves out of it at a very is something which is more sceptical than I would prefer. I think they're right with everything that's black, but an awful lot of the grey stuff should be pink, etc. Right. The other thing is the mythicists. I take the point that Carrier actually has cred, but if you come down to Carrier's personal attitude, even he thinks that there was a historical person that this had to be hung on, that it wasn't a complete fiction. My view on that has tended to be that there were certainly plenty of other proto-messiahs, people who vanished into his remainder catalogue. Why was this one the one on which others made a religion? And I think there has to be something reasonably remarkable about him. My best bet on that one is that when it comes to the resurrection, there were understandable psychological reactions in some of the disciples which produced, at least in their minds, apparitions of a resurrected Christ. And I think that happened to quite a few of them, and then that got decorated. Paul says there were 500. I think that's probably exaggerated by a fact. But I think there has to be something of that kind for that movement to take off at that point. So if you can say resurrection appearances as accounts of apparitions, they make much more sense at that point. But you've got to regard them as the inner workings of people's minds rather than anything further or more than that. And I read the whole thing as more history of thought than history of real events in any event.
Well, I think on the resurrection, Mark made a good point about mentioning that a lot of writings might have been writing, creating a history that would correspond to earlier prophecies as well. So, whether or not that they were imagined or, well, I don't know. You didn't quite say hallucination, but it could have just been back writing, creating an event to have it fit with earlier predictions as well. Not that that means that what you said isn't exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It's just other.
there isn't actually any previous Jewish warrant for a physical resurrection happening to anybody.
But never mind.
So,
Well, but that's yeah. So that's one of the points that Sheehan makes is that he
Sure.
thinks that Paul, for instance, is not talking about a physical resurrection. That he's talking about
Oh, I
something
agree.
that's more in line with the tradition. That this is something that is not until Luke or something, until after the temple destruction. That yeah. So this linguistic point that the word that would have corresponded to resurrection is not actually the Greek word used. It's awakening, and that was something that was very fixed in the tradition.
See, now that makes it very odd, though, doesn't it? I mean, if Paul is not thinking of a physical resurrection, and the gospel writers are writing about a physical resurrection, you've got two communities of people, both with a different idea of the events that precede them. What happened 30 years ago to Paul? What happened, well, a bit more than that. Maybe let's say what happened 30, 40 years ago in Paul's mind. Not the physical resurrection of Jesus. What happened 60 years ago in Luke's mind? The physical resurrection of Jesus. Are we talking about a historical person then? Because, I mean, I think we are. Let me just say that. I think on balance we are. But it's so extremely peculiar that in the minds of one person who's writing about it, there is no physical resurrection. Certainly, well, not just in Paul, but probably in maybe even some other people. But
Hebrews, for example.
yes, but in the minds of the gospel writers, there is such a resurrection. So, are the gospel writers writing history at this point, or are they giving you a narrative giving you a sort of a literary narrative of the story of a person's life?
A faith interpretation, yeah. That Sheehan said, actually, we're being stupid in thinking that they thought they were writing a history, that they didn't think that at all.
No.
Yeah, that's not how history was written at the time. I mean, history, until very recently, was written to create a narrative about what should and should not be. I think that's fairly well known, so there's no reason to think that they were trying to write a textbook.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the most amusing ironies to give to literalists is that none of the authors of the New Testament were literalists. If you look at Paul's interpretation of the Old Testament, if you look at any of their interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, they're all crazy. Paul's interpretation of Sarah and Hagar as being the two mothers of Jerusalem on earth and Jerusalem on heaven, that's just not at all in any potential possible reading of the story in the Old Testament what that's about. Couldn't possibly be. It even sounds crazy to people listening to Paul, no doubt, and yet Paul's doing it. So if you look at, I mean, even Jesus himself, when he's quoting things, he's quoting purely allegorically. So that said, did Paul, when writing Romans or writing Colossians or something, think of himself as writing scripture? That is something liable to being interpreted that way? I don't think so. So on the one hand, we can say the writers of the Gospels probably weren't writing history in their own minds, but on the other hand, I don't think we can say of Paul's letters, for example, that he was doing something the same. That I think he was writing what he was thinking at the time.
One thing you brought up too, though, and I thought of this sort of vaguely as I was listening to the lectures. I don't know that she had needed to deal with this a whole lot in what he was talking about, but you mentioned that if you look at the Gospels versus Paul, we're looking at two different communities, and I actually think I have to always remind myself that actually we're talking about tons of different communities that were far more disconnected than I think I mean, I'm talking to people in Germany and England right now. Like, we're used to a world that is so much more interconnected than most of human history developed within, and then most of human mythologizing developed in. And so one of the reasons I actually think that the scriptures are so rich is that they did develop in these little communities that couldn't easily transfer information back and forth in a lifetime. It could get moved around over the course of time, but those layers accrued slowly. And I will say though, I have sort of a strange mind when it comes to religion, which is probably why I'm able to continue to be religious, but it doesn't actually seem strange to me for Paul to be talking about a resurrected Christ, that he doesn't mean physically resurrected, and to sort of, I almost want to say, not care about a historical Jesus. I think, Michael, you might have said something about, like, is he talking about an actual Jesus? And if Jesus of Nazareth was a real person, if we like grant that for a moment, then he had real historical effects on the people around him, and presumably Paul, having been a Pharisee, was one of those people. So we'll assume for a moment Jesus was real and Paul knew of him as a real person. It doesn't seem, actually, from a religious sort of mystical standpoint, it doesn't actually seem very important to connect the experience of having a vision of someone coming to you and speaking to you with the actual person in real life. To me, those two don't have to be very factually connected, and so I don't know that they would have to be for someone like Paul.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that your sort of feeling on that reflects a pretty broad, I won't say consensus, but a pretty broad standpoint. For me, the issue is, so if we take the existence of sayings gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, which we have, or the Gospel of Q, which we sort of assume existed at some point, that Jesus we view as some sort of preacher, some sort of historical figure who had either really intelligent or compelling interpretations of Torah, or was somehow an important, apocalyptic preacher. However we want to conceptualize him. The later success of Christianity was a direct result, in some way, of his being an exceptional person, right? So for me, it's a bit strange when we look at Paul, and he is a very strongly committed Christian, and says again and again he's become a Christian due to revelation of this presumably directed figure who was once on earth. For the early Christians to be so not uninterested, but for the fact that the things that Jesus said personally don't come up when Paul is arguing, trying to convince congregations of certain spiritual points. The way that he only ever quotes Jesus through Psalms or through interpretations of the Old Testament. It's very, very odd. As opposed to your point about the bodily resurrection and all that, maybe that's not quite as strange. But for me, there are still some inconsistencies with the strength of the early Christian movement, which was undoubtedly, you saw in different provinces, in many different cities, maybe even in Rome, just shortly after Jesus' death would have been. And yet, the personal Jesus, who was theoretically responsible for this religion, doesn't show up in the way that you might expect him to.
Yeah, I think that
for me, that's a more.
Sorry, I think we're having connection issues. I thought you'd stop, but I was going to say the person for me who is exceptional here is Paul, not Jesus. I think Jesus is probably ten a penny, and Paul's the, he's really the guy who sort of latches on to this preacher, maybe, or latches on to this idea that's sort of fermenting around the destruction of the Second Temple and turns it into a movement. I think I don't think Christianity at the turn of the, certainly not the time of the Second Temple, I don't think it was that big of anything of a thing. I don't think it was that big for another century. But I think it was the efforts of Paul just running around like a fanatic madman. Every single city he went to, he went dozens of places, building lots of churches. Just this very fervent person going around trying to build a movement. I think it's remarkable. And I do believe that of him. I believe that all that's true. I think it makes him a remarkable individual. I don't think, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, that they were probably all that different from many preachers of the time.
Well, so I like that some of you have made the jump to the third main topic that I wanted to cover tonight. We've talked about the how is this as a bit of scholarship? How are we taking it as an appeal to authority? And we've talked a little bit about the outlines of the historical picture provided. But then the big question is, from a philosophical point of view, do we care? That is it possible? It seems that you could have a perfectly developed, elaborate form of Christianity that even pays a lot of attention to some of the historical, the historical teachings, the teachings that have been spread by Christianity throughout history, but that don't and not really care if they're rooted in the teachings of one individual back in time and that is in fact the Son of God. That like all world religions, Christianity is ultimately talking about God, about ultimate metaphysics, and so this, whether this is a founding myth or not is historically accurate is maybe beside the point. Well, I mean, what do folks think about that? Is that, or do you think, like, if there's no actual resurrection, come on, don't be a Christian anymore, forget that. At least that's usually a sticking point.
I think that's for Christians themselves to decide, and I think by and large they've decided it's important. I think by and large for Christians that they say if there's no resurrection, then yes, it all does fall away quite substantially, and good for them for saying it, and it's not true, and so it should all fall away substantially.
Well, but so John Dominic Crossan, for one, is a Christian, definitely. I mean, he was actually a member of the clergy. He got out of it because he wasn't Orthodox enough, but he's not a Unitarian, and he, says that we have that with the rise of the Enlightenment, we get this literalism. We get the attempt to talk about facts in the way that scientists, following a misleadingly positivist image of science, which has since been overthrown tenfold, latched onto that, and so that this whole notion that the gospel writers, either they were doing history or they were lying. You don't want to accuse them of lying, do you? Like, this is what you hear. Is it a fact? Is it not a fact? Like that's the way that normal people who don't study philosophy think about truth nowadays, on this very naive, realist picture that either it's true or it's not true. And Crossan thinks that is the mistake, that we have to understand something like mythological truth, or that there still could be, in the notion of resurrection itself, something deeply inspiring, and without actually saying, somebody was dead and then now is walking around as a fleshy being and then physically ascended to a heaven. That of course, given our cosmological picture now and how that differs from the picture way back then, that's not going to make sense anymore.
I liked that he actually did the math of how long it would take Jesus to leave the galaxy. That was very funny. That was beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
I was seeing Jesus like flying through space. It was great. That was great.
I think that was pre-relativity too. So that's
absolutely.
Surely they didn't have the science fiction advances that you could just go to another dimension. You don't have to travel. You just go foop, your face. Now I'm in the ethereal plane, or what?
Yeah. I think the question of because I'm really familiar with. Maybe he's characterized as a historian, but I would describe Crossan as actually a theologian to some extent. Mm-hmm. That, like Borg and those kinds of theologians who talk about Scripture, and I think to some extent they're right, that a vast quantity of what we call Scripture was written as poetry in a very real sense, in a very, very, very real sense. And that it's meant to be read that way. And, if you take sort of like a Joseph Campbell approach to reading myth, that myth gives you beautiful things that you can use to interpret your life, and you don't need to worry so much about the historical veracity of the claims, or I don't even want to just say historical veracity, like the material reality of the claims. And to some extent, I subscribe to that thinking. I think that it's one of the things that I really notice, because my life is strange, and I have these intellectual conversations with people, and then I work with families. And in working with families, story matters, like story and how you frame psychological experiences and social experiences and all of that. Story is what shapes communities, and it's what shapes identity. So it feels more true to most of human experience, actually, to me, to talk about the mythical aspects as though that was what mattered. But I will say, and this is something that I'm always sort of running in the background of my mind. Sometimes that, just on a personal level, that feels like a cop-out. It feels like a cop-out to say, like, well, I'm gonna use the myths and the stories to interpret my life and to find meaning and to figure things out for myself. And then I can put my secular, modern, developed world person hat on and say, like, oh, no, I don't believe that Jesus was somehow unique or something like that. Because I think that most believers, even some of the most liberal, like myself at least, do actually have a sense of some claims about reality that we are making. That it's not, I'm not just telling a story and then saying, oh, no, do with that what you will. I am, in my own mind at least, making claims about reality, and I do think that sometimes when I hear people like Crossan and Borg and Sheehan talk about it as though you can just divide the world into this like convenient, here I am with my secular hat on, don't be scared of me liberal secular people, and then now I have my mythical hat on so I can talk about being a real human. It feels too simple to say that you can just draw that line and like flip between the two camps. It feels like a really modern, I almost want to say schizophrenic like way of viewing the world.
Well, that's what we got out of Law on the podcast, him talking as if that's what he did. But with Crossan, I think he in his secular self just thinks that, no, if you think of the secular self as a no-nonsense positivist view of facts, then that's just confused. So he just really has a crazy philosophy, and it was awesome that I heard him. If you look on podcast, he's a really entertaining guy. If you look on podcast appearances of him, that he was on this evangelical Christian radio show, some interview from the 80s, where just after the Historical Jesus came out, his big explosive book, and then they take callers after he's done with the interview. This guy takes call, and the host, kind of has a good conception, can kind of get where Crossan is coming from, but then these callers, these everyday people that call him, like, that was the craziest person I've ever heard, that they just can't. But it's that the mistake is not this picture of that there has to be a line, is that's what's wrong, and that's what I don't quite understand yet. That I feel like I need to pick out some better readings and do some more podcast episodes to get at if this is just this postmodern picture that itself is really cheesy and should be dismissed, or whether there's really something to this.
Well, thinking about like what the way Law looked at it, I mean, I think Law, and I am speaking for him now, and I have no right to do so, but just it sounds to me like he might be approaching this in sort of, because I know other people who do this might be approaching this sort of secular viewpoint, despite the fact that they are very deeply religious, as maybe part of a thought experiment to say, here's what people who don't believe what I believe about this, here's the way that they think about it, and I want to understand that. So, like, if we're talking about Rawls' veil of ignorance thought experiment, right? Like, there's no way to put ourselves in that position because it's just silly. But taking as a, I think what Law and people who share something along those lines might be doing when he makes those sort of dualist statements about, obviously I don't mean mind-body dualism, when he's talking about if somebody does not share my beliefs that I cannot alter because I very personally in a spiritual way believe this to be true regardless of what the reality is out there, if I set those aside and look at this in a secular way, I can still be intelligent and think through this, putting my beliefs aside despite the fact that I still hang on to them. So I don't know necessarily that creates a conflict. It just is sort of a thought experiment from that perspective, and that's how it appears to me, I guess.
Yeah, John, and I just want to hop on and also say we're also coming at this from an interesting perspective, and we're sort of, out of habit, excluding a possibility, which I don't think deserves to be excluded out of hand, which is that it is possible, theoretically, logically possible, that historical Jesus, man on earth, etc., never existed, but Christianity is still true.
Yeah.
Because there were there were rival interpretations of Christianity very, very early, very high Christology interpretations, Docetism, Marcionites. Mm-hmm. They had what we would today consider to be off-the-wall interpretations of scriptures or of the Sayings Gospels or what have you. But there's nothing that makes those inherently less likely than the one that has come down to us with the historical Jesus in tow. The Marcionites, the Docetists, they could have been correct. So, just because, and this gets back to the question, do we even care? Was historical Jesus a real thing or not? Well, there were a lot of Christians, early Christians, who would have identified as Christians, who would have said no. So, I mean, we can clearly get some form of Christianity off the ground without a historical Jesus. So in that sense, it is sort of an academic question, even beyond this distinction between, the postmodern understanding of truth and so on and so forth. The historicity question and the theological, metaphysical question are clearly separate questions, even from the point of view of some classes of believers. So,
I like Sheehan's characterization of the Council of Nicaea. That sort of settled which books. I don't know if it settled which books actually got in the Bible, but definitely sort of which among the competing interpretations of early creeds were acceptable and which were not, and shoved together these disparate the Paul tradition with the gospel traditions and even the different gospels that he characterized it as. This is Constantine, a murderer of his own family, made these guys get into a room and there's too much political unrest. Just settle this. You're not coming out of the room until you come up with, a unified creed. That this is the political situation that led to what Christianity, for the early folks was.
They carried that tradition forward to elect popes. It's beautiful.
Yes.
So I just wanted to touch on the two issues that you raised, Mark. The one about the Enlightenment separation and the postmodernism. Now, I'm skeptical about both of those views. Just to deal with the postmodernism one first, there's a way of, I think, characterizing the debate between atheists and Christians, or believers really in general. And I think where atheists doubt the existence of God, theists doubt God. Right? They fundamentally believe there is such a thing as God. They feel the psychological presence of the divine in some way. They believe the world has the character of I don't want to say a supernatural element, but it has a extra dimension to it which isn't purely material. They feel some kind of presence of something that's not just materiality. And given that feeling, the debate is about whether or not to trust it, what shape it takes, what form it has, who speaks for it, all of that kind of thing. And atheists just don't even feel that. They're not even in that game. They're talking about something different. And I think when postmodernist speakers, people who put two different hats on, they're not even thinking about the atheist camp. They don't even know what that feels like. They're just saying, I feel this is here, the presence of the divine is in the background. What I'm talking about when I doubt Jesus or I doubt Christianity or I'm skeptical about Christianity is just, it doesn't really matter what it amounts to, because if that feeling is there, the divine is there, God is there. It doesn't matter if it was in the form the gospel said, it doesn't matter if it was exactly as Paul described it, because it's there. So I think they are being disingenuous when they say they're putting two hats on. They're not putting two hats on. They don't even see the atheist hat. They don't know even what it feels like to experience the world from a truly atheist point of view. All their two hats are the hat of a Christian who believes in God, and the hat of a scientific person who believes in God, right, or a secular person. It's two people who both experience the world in a semi-divine way, and one person taking Christianity strongly, and another person taking Christianity very weakly. So I think it is disingenuous to say that you can wear these two hats. I think in the background there is this psychological consistency in both of their views of the world, where there really is this thing in the background. It's a question of what form does it take, how do you trust it, is it good, is it moral, is it leading in the right direction, the wrong direction, all of these things. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing on the Enlightenment is, if you read the Council of Nicaea, the creed coming from the Council of Nicaea, it reads as a literal historical thing, right? You're meant to believe these things happened. It's not, let's weave in myth, it's a bit poetic, blah, blah, blah. No, these are the things you have to believe if you're going to say you're a Christian. These are real events that happened in the world. These are things you have to take as true. I don't think that pre-Enlightenment we were just in a confusion of myth and fact, and no one could tell, were there witches, or does it rain? Is the sun going to come up tomorrow, or is magic real? No, I think there actually was a feeling that some things were more mythological, some things were more factual, and perhaps for most of the time people didn't make strong delineations. But those delineations did exist in points of time, and in part people's mythologies were pegged to facts that they took to be the case. You know, that from the inside a narrative, inside a story, that story has force for you because you believe parts of it are true. And it isn't just the case that we can slip into this postmodernism thing where we all say, oh, we can tell stories, but we can't. You end up not feeling them because they're not pegged to truth in some way. And that's why I think this, to connect the dots on both of those 2 points, that's why I think this modern postmodernism is disingenuous, because really what they are saying is, no, we have a peg to truth. It's just so far away you can't see it. It's just that really in this sort of mythical, this sort of semi-divine feeling, we've just pegged it really to that, and it doesn't really matter what the story says. But it is still pegged to something that's true, that they believe about the world, that it's not just a material reality, if you like.
I've seen a lot of interesting facial expressions from Chris, and you haven't talked in a while, so please respond. You have some thoughts here?
I don't know if he heard you.
Chris, you've been asked to respond.
One thing that's struck me is, as per my introduction, I had an experience and went looking for a language of description of it, a language in which I could talk about it and which was generally understood to deal with. So I went looking first anywhere but the Christianity I'd been brought up with. And it interests me that it's only really the Judeo-Christian religions who are hung up on historical accuracy of the founding myths they're talking about. The average Buddhist is not bothered if Gautama ever existed. The Hindus aren't bothered whether Krishna and Arjuna were real people, that kind of thing. Why is it that it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam thing?
You know, I'm sorry, Chris, are you done asking that question, sort of?
Yeah.
Okay. One thing, actually, that I learned when I traveled to India and did some studies on what... I want so badly to get into Indian philosophy, but it's so hard. But I did discover they are... and this is fairly recent. But India is... undergoing a very strong and growing wave of Hindu fundamentalism, and it is obsessed with factual accuracy to the extent that I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Ramayana, but like, you know, there's India and then Sri Lanka, and in the Ramayana, Rama crosses the water and to get to Sita, and like he puts these. He writes his name on these stones, and that makes them float, and then they walk on the stones across to Sri Lanka. So, you know, like in the 20th century, they're, you know, geographical, whatever. They realize that there is actually this that Sri Lanka and India were once connected. That there's like this sort of underground bit of land that was connecting them, and they were all once part of one. And so they're able to see this from the sky and underwater and stuff. And so whatever universities discovered this, they released papers on it, you know, stating facts, like there was land and then there was water came up over the land, and so it's not connected anymore. And the fundamentalists were upset enough and had enough clout that they were actually able to compel the Indian government to change the narrative to actually we have found evidence of, you know, Rama's stones and the crossing from India to Lanka. And what I thought was really interesting about this was that fundamentalism is taking root there, that it is a fairly recent occurrence, and that seems... I just wish that I understood more about what causes the rise of that kind of factual fundamentalism. It seems like it's probably linked to something to do with their development in terms of like becoming much more scientifically inclined and becoming much more economically materialistic and capitalistic. But I don't know. I just thought
it's our fault in some way. It's the West's fault in some way.
Yes, it's totally our fault. It has to be our fault.
I mean, as long as I can feel
threat
guilty.
response there too. You have neighbors who are. There's a lot of Islamic fundamentalism, obviously, on the borders. It could be a response to that, and what you said about science. And I mean, I'm not claiming to have an answer, but there's a lot of threats that could cause that sort of fundamentalist response. Not that that's an answer. I don't know anything about this.
Yeah,
seems intuitive.
Well, fundamentalism can only happen when the epistemic standards of science have won. So, I mean, the battleground of what determines what we should believe, science has succeeded in order for fundamentalism to happen because they're speaking the language of what would previously be considered their enemy, perhaps, or even an irrelevant friend. They're speaking scientific language, and as soon as you begin to speak the language of someone of science, and then you're speaking in myth, then you can't win. So,
I mean, I don't know about that though. Let's just imagine that, let's say you have religion A and religion B, and one becomes super fundamentalist and starts attacking the other. The other might respond by being equally fundamentalist because they have something to defend. I don't know. I mean, obviously science is involved there. I don't know if that's a necessity though.
So, is there a way forward that I think one of the ongoing things that we've been dealing with in the podcast is getting past this view, this simplistic view of science, and in particular, thinking that the social sciences, in other words, anything that, unless you're trying to build something that actually matters, for human relations, that they can't adhere to this model. And so, what is the alternative? Surely you can't mean somebody just posted on the blog recently, like as a comment, what do you mean you're rejecting science? We're trying to come up with models. Surely you don't want to go back to ignorance. So, but there's supposed to be some extra enlightenment, more developed picture of what social science, what intelligent knowledge gathering is about, that takes into account, say, the insights of hermeneutics. So our last couple episodes in that area. Is it even possible that we could have a culture that could, I guess you have to assume that there actually is something there, that it's not just postmodernist, something that you would dismiss in the way that sounded like Michael was dismissing it. And I gotta say, even among the continental professors that I had, like postmodernism was like a fringe, and it was a temporary, like, cultural thing in the 60s or 70s that people have gotten over, that it amounts to sort of denying the principle of non-contradiction. It is not a serious position. But so is there a more, I know we're just spitballing here, a more modest version of that actually is concrete enough, is understandable, that can take root, so our culture could become not anymore, could still be scientific, could still be rational, but not prone to the misunderstandings that would give rise to fundamentalism, if we're taking this Michael's description of the picture seriously.
Okay, well, maybe as the last social scientist as well, maybe I could take a stab at. I mean, so this sort of scientific, what a lot of people maybe even rightly call scientistic, meaning, thinking that the scientific method is the only way to discover knowledge about the world. A lot of that, I really feel, again, coming from political science, which is what my master's was in, I really feel that it's sort of a temporary phenomenon that stems out of living in a society that values economics, that values hard science, can place a big dollar value on that, and doesn't value the humanities, doesn't value the sort of squishy inquiry into the soul and to philosophy and so on and so forth. And as a survival strategy, a lot of these formerly squishy subjects have had to adopt scientific methods in order to put the clothing of science on their endeavors. And I think it's really to the detriment of the social sciences, and that's one of the reasons I got out, is because it just doesn't, when you're dealing with things that are as complicated as a single human mind even, or certainly a society, you stop having the ability, at least now, you don't have the ability to do the calculations or build the models that are going to accurately reflect reality. And so maybe we need some sort of post-scientific or I don't want to say anti-scientific, but ascientific methodology for at least trying to come to grips with that sort of thing. And I think the lack of acceptance, maybe the ending of acceptance of that sort of approach, I think has created these kind of conflicts that now we're seeing between, well, the postmodernist philosophy on the one hand versus statistics and economics on the other. I think it's simply a function of money. But then again, I would say that I'm a political scientist.
We need to rebrand hermeneutics, make it sound less German, get rid of that word in particular, make it a trendy American common sense thing. Come on, of course you can't do models when you're talking about psychology,
Right.
Political politics, who's going to win the election. We know from experience that those pollsters, that their models don't work. So let's just stop being pretentious about it and, try to make it sound all folksy.
I'd be happy to admit, and I think many people would today, right this moment, that there's a plurality of machinery, standards, values, goodness and badness, better and worse, in coming up with explanations for stuff. Science has its own set of tools for doing that. English literature has a literary set of tools for doing that. Art has another set of tools for doing that. And each community with each of these standards can say, well, that's a good interpretation, that's a bad one. So you can say, Newtonian gravity is a bad interpretation and Einsteinian is a good interpretation or a better one. So lots of categories exist. But the onus, which is implied, I think, by what was just said. I can't remember your name. I should probably ought to. Benjamin, that's right. Yeah. There's an implied onus there on behalf of the people within those communities to change the minds of people outside of those communities. Let me spell this out very clearly. If Christians think that Christianity comes down to a matter of establishing the facts of various things in a scientific way, if they think that, then they ought to use the methods of science. They can't have their cake and eat it. They can't say, oh, no, we believe this, we believe this, we believe this, and then when we come to determine whether it's true or not, we have to use artistic standards. No. If you're going to make scientific claims, or claims that ought to properly fit within the community of scientific standards, then you ought to use those standards to evaluate those claims. And it is just the fact that if you go around and ask Christians today, most Christians today, what are the status of their claims? And the status of their claims are, that they ought to be evaluated in this scientific way. Now, that may be, you may say that's a bad thing, but then it is up to the Christian community themselves to move those claims into a different category, or to abandon them, or to reevaluate them. So I don't think a postmodernist position is possible, in the sense that I don't think it's possible to make a claim that belongs within one community with one set of standards and one set of practices, and then turn around and say, no, you can make that claim, but with none of those standards, practices, good sense of goodness and badness. In other words, I don't think you can say the moon is made of rock, and then turn around and say, oh no, what I really meant was, it needs to be painted with gouache, and we should interpret it as this and that. I think if you're going to make a claim that properly belongs to one set of standards, then it ought to be evaluated within those set of standards.
There's a lot of claims that could feel like they might be. I mean, the existence of sort of an active God it makes that really difficult. I mean, if you buy into that, of course. I mean, having been raised Catholic, there's part of this is actually the body and blood of Christ. Like, you're drinking blood at communion. That's the way it is. And is that testable? Absolutely. Okay, let's look at this under a microscope. Turns out it's Franzia. It's really cheap wine. That's what it is. But for someone, and I in Catholic school, I'd ask people about this, the Christian brothers who were there, who, were big influences on me just because they were amazingly good people and amazingly intelligent people. And they'd be like, they would say things that sounded like, we are making a factual claim about what this is or is not, but it is unable to be tested by science because it is this continuous divine miracle. Now, does that mean that it's nonsense? I mean, I think so, but there's no way to test that, and it can't be combated. I think you're completely right that it's up to them to prove those things or not. But when dealing with things that have to be taken entirely on faith, it's really, really tough to make a convincing argument about why that has to be tested in the same way that we test science to change people's minds who just believe something because they do.
Here's the problem for you. Here's my question put very succinctly in what you've just said. Is faith another category of standards, measurements, tools, and practices for establishing reasonable and unreasonable? Or is it a get-out card for making claims in one community and then abandoning that community when you want those claims tested?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Of course it is. But what you said about having it be reasonable, I mean, that claim in particular is obviously not reasonable, but it gets outside of the realm of reason entirely. And, you know, is that convincing? Of course not. But I'm just saying, in making that argument to people who have certain religious bents and who believe things very strongly, that's not going to be a convincing argument to those people. Now, is it a convincing argument generally? Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't believe that that's wine. I'm just saying that it's not maybe a good way to approach those questions to people who believe them or don't believe them. That doesn't mean that it's a good or bad method. I'm just saying that approaching it in that way for people of faith is not going to be terribly effective a lot of the time.
So I want to hear an answer to that by the folks on the call, if there are any that actually that the term faith has some resonance in your lives.
Well, I was a little confused by the question because it sounded like there were only two options, and I didn't like either of them. What were they again?
There are two options. Let me tell you what they are. So my concern, I'll try to be very brief. My concern is this, right? Some groups of people establish some standards for evaluating some claims. Let's take science. It has a scientific method, a plurality of methods. It can evaluate goodness and badness of certain scientific claims, like the moon is round or the earth is a sphere. You can say that's a good bad claim or a bad claim. Now, there are some statements about the world that properly belong to the category of science. The earth is a sphere, should properly be evaluated under the light of scientific methods. There are some claims that don't belong to the sphere of science, like Sherlock Holmes was arrogant. That properly belongs to the category of literary interpretation. And the methods of literary interpretation should be used to evaluate that. You shouldn't try to look for atoms or causes or physical manifestations of Sherlock Holmes to establish if he was arrogant. You should do literary interpretation. My question was, is faith another such category? A group of people have come together, have established some standards for evaluating some claims. They have some methods, you have some ideas about how to evaluate them, and they can say those claims are good and those claims are bad. Is faith such a category of investigation of the truth? Or is it a get-out-of-jail card where some people want to make scientific claims like there was a person who did this, but then when we come to ask them to evaluate those claims, they say, oh, no, you can't evaluate them using the proper standards that ought to be used. You have to just abandon all standards altogether or use some others. Like, for example, it seems to me, in some instances, people are saying the Earth is a sphere, and then when you go, what's the evidence for the Earth is a sphere? They go, well, read this book, we're using literary methods. Or, well, you have to understand that if you go to cinema and you watch it this way, it seems like they're using completely different set of standards that don't apply. Mm-hmm. So my question was, is faith another category of investigation, or is it just a get-out-of-jail-free card when you say when you come to apply the proper standards of investigation to the kinds of claims they're making?
I think the way I think of it, I mean I think the reason that particular dichotomy sounds strange to me is I don't actually think of faith, and I actually think it is interesting. I do think that most Christians, I think you're right, that if you cornered most people who claim to be Christian, they would absolutely say, yes, I believe that these claims have material reality. I believe that there's like a historical, physical grounding for some of these claims, or especially the important ones. But I guess I don't think of, You talk about science as like a realm of inquiry where presumably people are trying to find truth. And I do think that's actually what most scientists are trying to do. Certainly some people treat religion that way, but I think of it more in terms of, and this is what I think actually does lead to that dichotomy, is that they're actually looking for a way to describe their own experience, and it doesn't, most people don't go through life, they don't, even if they say they do. Most people don't go through life actually trying to find out the truth. they go through life trying to make themselves known to other people. And if they're really, really good people, they also try to know other people. And the way you do that is you try to find the best language to describe your experience. And that is the major reason that I think that religion continues to thrive, is that scientific reasoning, the language of science, doesn't describe some of the most important moments of your life. I mean, if you walk out the door and you almost get hit by a car and you have that like jolt of fear, or you see an animal get slaughtered for meat, or you have like a really like a strong emotional experience, and then you're trying to describe it to a friend later on, you don't say like, well, and then this hormone got released in my brain, and then that linked up to this hormone and these cells in my brain, and da-da-da-da. You don't describe it that way. You describe it in a very personal way. And religion gives the vast majority of humans a really good language for describing their experience. People are not, in their day-to-day lives, looking for a way to inquire after truth. They aren't. They're trying to make themselves known to other people. So
if I might just say very briefly that is consistent with the first option I gave. What I meant with different communities is that they also have different ideas of what truth means. So that literary truth is different from scientific truth. So to have a truth of experience is equally then to have a set of methods and standards and better and worse and good and bad that relate to the truth of experience. And what you're saying is religious experience gives people a machinery of expressing emotional truth and psychological truth. And that's what religion is about, which is fine, brilliant, good. But then we should really apply those standards then. That's the standards we should apply to religious claims. Then fine. But then you have a battle of convincing religious people that that's the case. Not. Yeah.
No, but then if that is actually the claim that if it is landing in the camp of effectively a scientific claim, then how do you verify it? Then the verification questions would be along the lines of, does it accurately describe your experience?
Yeah, but that's what you have to have as a community, right? I mean, if you say, oh, that was a miracle, and what happened was, someone knocked on the door. Oh, someone knocking on the door is a miracle. Oh my God, Jesus is here. And someone goes, are you crazy? It's just your neighbor knocking on the door. People would think in your religious community you were being insane if you described every little thing as a miracle. So there is such a standard of goodness and badness with respect to religious claims that do establish good and bad interpretations of the world based on religious narratives. So it is the case that there is a verification, but the verification doesn't have to be scientific. It just has to be related to a community of people with certain practices and things and so on.
So if I can hook this back up to Sheehan to maybe give us a final point to go out on. So his way of giving the folksy version of what I've been calling postmodernism here, which I think is what you're describing as, that there's just another hermeneutic strategy or set of standards by which we approach religious language as opposed to scientific language. Is this what I think John started referring to at the beginning before we started recording with is his diagramming of a sentence of S equals P, and I found this a singularly unhelpful model.
Yeah,
and he went on.
It's amazing to me that he chooses to repeat it at least 12 times.
Does anybody sort of remember that well enough to give us a picture of how that expresses what we've been talking about here, or do you not make that?
No, I mean, what he does bring up the point about, I can't remember it was a trifold distinction between historicity, historicism, and historicality. I don't really remember, but there was one of them where it was, this is what this means to you, this is the significance it has in your life personally.
Yeah.
And as a clear distinction from whether it actually took place and then whether it was, I don't remember. I didn't find it super helpful, but I think it was sort of circumscribing what we're getting at here, which is...
I do remember it.
Okay, hit me.
It was
just S equals P is subject equals predicate. I mean, that
right.
get out of the way. But
that's
go
helpful.
ahead, Mike.
I don't want to talk too much, but I thought if I did remember it, I might jump in. So there's three meanings of the word historic, which is an event is historic, as in, you know, the Queen's Jubilee is historical. It's a big significant thing. It's you know, people turn up and celebrate it and stuff. So it's like a sportscaster might say, well, that was a historic whatever that happens in America.
Meaning it was factually accurate that it just happened.
Yeah, someone hit a ball very far. That's what happens, isn't it? Someone, you know, had a bat and they hit a ball and it went very far, and that was historic. So that's historic, as in, you know, significant kind of thing. Then there's a history in the way that you read books have titles, like a history of the Middle Ages or a history of someone's life, and that's an interpretation of some event by a community of scholars coming up with a plausible explanation of something. So that's kind of like a model, if you like, a history as a model. And then there's the history, which is the real thing that actually happened. So
historiography, I think he called it.
Well, historiography is the writing of
It's a study, yeah.
Yeah.
The writing of histories, in the sense of the writing of models, is a historiography. So what he was saying is that we can never really have the history. All we can have is a history, a model. And what we mean by a history in this particular class, or this particular sense, is a history we arrive at through the scientific or the critical historical method. So what his course was about writing a history of Jesus Christ, using the tools and methods of historical critique.
Right. So the point I wanted to sort of take this distinction in is, let's say that science is what we're calling science. We're referring to this sort of one aspect of human inquiry. Science is the what happened, exactly. Right. So just take an experience relevant to me. Indianapolis Colts won Super Bowl 41. That is a fact in a scientific sense. Right. So if I can make sort of an analogy similar to what Mike was saying earlier, you know, something like a faith truth, something similar, would be the day the Colts won was the best day of my entire life. Now, is that demonstrable in any scientific sense whatsoever? Definitely not, because first of all, it's not even possible to prove until I die, and once I'm dead, you can't prove it either. I mean, that would be an equivalent of a faith truth that resonates with me because, because the problem is, of course, I mean, these vocabularies and these areas of inquiry outside of science are subjective. And for me personally, none of the faith vocabularies presented in the religions I've had contact with, the organized religions, none of them have been useful or applied to me or described anything that I ever felt or experienced. So I think, number one, I think it's fair to make a distinction. So Mike's first category, it's like literary analysis. Sherlock Holmes was arrogant. Indianapolis Colts winning the Super Bowl is the best day of my life, and Jesus is the Son of God. I mean, we could put those in one sort of branch, and then science is completely separate. And then Stephen Jay Gould has his non-overlapping magisteria. Sorry, I'm name dropping, but here's the problem, and here's the problem I think Mike's getting at, and I think everybody really experiences, is I really have not met many religious people that are satisfied with that. I've met a couple. I guess Tara Leigh, you'd be one of them. I've had some roommates before. Most of the religious people I've met are not just making a faith claim in the sense I described, right? Most of them, you know, the Nicene Creed, the Apostolic Creed, like, that's not a faith claim. That's actually a claim about history. That's actually a claim about things that really happened. And whereas when I said, you know, historicity could be false, the historicity of Jesus could be false, and Christianity could still be true, I mean, I think that that's, you know, sort of objectively the case. I think I'm not going to say the majority because I don't know, but there'd be a lot of Christians who would disagree strongly with that. So I don't think it's illegitimate to play with religion on the playing field that is set up by religious people, even if it's not necessarily, you know, every religious person has to play by these rules. A lot of them are going to want to fight on those grounds. The Hindu fundamentalists are a great example. No one's forcing them to come and say that this is scientific proof of Hinduism. Yeah. They want it to be, and maybe in some sense they need it to be to maintain the faith truths. So, on the one hand, we can make useful distinctions between different forms of inquiry. On the other hand, we do have to engage with the conversation as it's actually happening. And in a lot of cases, and I think especially in the historicity of Jesus' case, the faith truths are bleeding over and making demands of historical truth. And in that sort of circumstance, do we care whether it's true? Well, I don't, because I'm not a Christian. But I know a lot of Christians that would. So it's a conversation worth having, in my opinion.
So this faith thing, I'm sure we could go on for another hour. Let's not do that. In fact, I'm trying to arrange a podcast with two guys from two different religious podcasts that had reached out to me at various points, a discussion about faith sometime this summer. So come on the after show for that, or we can have another Not School thing surrounding that. Are there other major things from the lectures, for concluding points? Let's sort of just go around and give us your closing or whatnot. Chris, we haven't heard from you in a while. Give us more of your wisdom.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm comfortable with Michael's analogy of literary criticism, though I personally hate literary criticism because I think it does anything it feels it wants to with texts.
Lacan.
Yeah, it describes experience for me. This one was a more comfortable fit for me than others because I actually grew up with some of the language, and being a lazy blighter, I didn't want to learn a different mythology. So that's my point of view.
That was one of the good pieces of wisdom I got in college from. It was actually the guy that taught. He was a leader in the Ann Arbor Jewish community who taught the intro world religions class. That really you should just go with whatever tradition you grew up in. As if the point is not to search for truth out there, but to get back to something that pre-rational was drilled into you, and that there's, even though you don't want to take a blind approach to that in any way, but that's going to be what is the language you learned. Just like if you completely switched over to some other language than literal language, something other than English, to inhabit all your dreams or something, then something would be lost out of there. So it's good. That's actually my kids are in an immersive Spanish thing, and a lot of that is so it's not for white kids like them to learn Spanish better. It's for the native. It's for immigrant kids who Spanish is their home language to actually, that if you don't give them the opportunity in academic setting to really elaborate that, then they end up not being such good scholars at all. Like if they're just forced to do English throughout, then the disconnect between the school language and what they actually think in, or what started thinking in, is too great, and it sort of just limits them as an so this is the theory. So write a parallel one for that for religion, and maybe that's what Chris is describing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Any other closings, John?
Sure. So I guess one of the main questions was, does it matter? And I kind of agree that I don't think that it does. And one argument I've actually gotten into in the past with someone who was very much set on the sort of Christian history of Jesus being the right one, I'd say, well, what do you think about the gold tablets buried in the yard, like this guy marching from Rochester, New York, over to Utah? Like, why is that more ridiculous? Is it just because it's more recent? Because it doesn't make any more sense than the sort of, Mormonism doesn't make less sense, it's just more recent. And there's not a lot of ways to get around those types of questions for those individuals, or to beat into a head that is not one to think about it. But the fact of the matter is, it's all really, really subjective, these sorts of histories, and trying to figure it out as best we can is a great thing to do, but we're not going to find an answer to it. And one of the most obnoxious things in my experience has been people who say, you can't prove this, I don't think Jesus existed at all, therefore the whole philosophy you're building out of this person is silly. And one of the things I think that's good to avoid is trying to berate that point to tear down something that can be otherwise really, really useful and make people's lives very rich. And I think reading the Gospel of Thomas is a great way to look into that for anyone. If you haven't done it, I'd recommend it because it's very enlightening, and it's a really nice piece of work. But does it matter? I mean, to me, no. Does it make you not Christian to not believe those things? Yeah, obviously it does, because you have to believe these things about the historical Jesus to be Christian, and so there will be people who will believe it just so they can say Christian. And I don't think there's a way to argue around that, but I think it is equally obnoxious to say you people are a bunch of idiots because you believe something irrationally.
Any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, we didn't even really get into the nitty-gritty on the historical Jesus, but I would like to piggyback off of John and just say, I mean, personally, having read a lot about it and also just having admit your biases up front, I have a contrarian bias. I like to believe things against the status quo. It's just my personality. So, my opinion at this moment is the evidence suggests that there was not a historical Jesus. It's more likely than not that he didn't exist. And it's an interesting question. It's an open question. It'll remain an open question. But with that statement, as I said before, it proves that Christianity doesn't need Jesus. Because if it never had him, you can't miss what you never had, right? So, on a certain level, as much as maybe Christians might disagree with me, yeah, for Christianity, for the theology, for that, doesn't make a bit of difference to them whether he existed or not. It's more an academic question. So, that's my closing.
All right, thanks, folks. I think this was great. This hit all the points that I wanted to hit, and let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, let's. Hey, Mark, when's the next podcast going out?
On Monday on Schopenhauer.
Right. Oh, my favorite.
Oh, Schopenhauer.
He's so cheery. In
All right,
German.
stop the broadcast.